Hello, and welcome to European Resilience Initiative Center. Today in our video podcast, we have Velina Tchakarova, who is geopolitical expert and consultant. She's the founder of her FACE Consultants Agency, and we welcome you in Warsaw.
Thank you for the invitation.
We have talked today a lot about what is the role of China in the Russian war against Ukraine and how China tries to intermediate the conflict as allegedly a neutral moderator. Do you think that this is what Europe needs?
Well, first, it is very important to understand China's position in this war. China is not neutral. It's not a neutral observer. It's not a neutral kind of mediating power that has come up with its own 12 points plan, even though that we've had already actually a Ukrainian peace plan proposed and propagated by the Ukrainian president. So let me start with this. What is China's stake in this war? What is important to understand is that Russia has heavily invested in the buildup of a modus vivendi of coordination with China over the last more than 10 years. Since Xi Jinping came to power in 2013, there has been this dimension of personal relationship where both Putin and Xi Jinping had a very similar view, over the U.S. global dominance, the U.S.-led international order, and how to create a credible counterweight to it. Then what happened, as we know, in 2014, is that the first invasion took place, and in fact, the Russian economy, the Russian currency were struggling. Russia wasn't prepared geo-economically following the invasion, and it was China that stepped in, intervened, made some international messaging and saved the economy and the currency from crashing. In fact, it saved Russia from probably the worst default since the 90s. And eventually this modus vivendi, so it's not a strategic alliance, it's not a strategic partnership, it's not anything that the West understands as a concept, based on shared values, based on shared norms or regulations. It is modus operandi in which both countries share similar vision about this transitionary period of the international relations, where they mostly fear, of course, the political instability at home. So they're backing each other in that matter. And then at the very same time, they're navigating together by actually coordinating measures, actions, within international and regional organizations, within common spheres of, and domains of policies, from, cyber, space, technology, and scientific exchange, to energy, of course, the big commodities portfolio. The one power is the biggest commodities importer in the world. The other is the biggest combined oil and gas exporter in the world. So you get the idea here. It's really a kind of a merge of geopolitical and geoeconomic interests. So here, what we've overlooked in the West, specifically in Europe, is that we draw the wrong conclusion that this war is, and it is, of course, first and foremost about Ukraine, about the subjugation of Ukraine. It is also about us, about the European security order, about the European successful economic model, and about, of course, our European values that we have been propagating for the last 30 years. But I argue that Russia, in fact, used this comprehensive modus vivendi of coordination with China and sought to amplify the systemic conflict, the newly emerging systemic conflict between Beijing and Washington, by taking the decision on launching a full-scale war against Ukraine, because Moscow knew this time China cannot remain neutral.
Before we go further to the questions of China's role in this war and how China supports Russia, does China support Russia, don't forget to like, share, subscribe to our channel, and stay connected with our TV channel to get the new information and new stunning interviews. Velina, my next question for you, you say that China is not neutral here, but many argue that China doesn't support Russia with technologies, like China doesn't support it with ammunition, with the guns, or do they?
Well, we still don't have the full scale of information about this exchange. Like I say, it is in the making. What we know for a fact, based on various investigative journalistic analysis, is that there are already dual-use goods that actually find their way to Moscow. One way is, for instance, through Western companies who are trading with China. For instance, they are exporting the goods to companies based in Hong Kong or in other Chinese, cities, and from there they find their way to the. So it's an indirect way of bypassing sanctions. Another way, of course, is that yes. At the moment, there are no indices, no proof that China is, in fact, providing military aid to Moscow. But what if? Let's deal with the question, what if? Because in reality, one of the main Russian narratives so far has been that Moscow is actually waging a war against NATO, that NATO is fighting against Russia. And in reality, it has been, has been creating the narrative of a proxy war. You will hear about this narrative probably in every European capital. But here, I argue that the real proxy war that could, and I'm not saying that it's going to happen, but that might happen if this, systemic conflict is being further amplified between Washington and Beijing, and currently, they have reached really the lowest point in their bilateral relationship. So if China decides to provide military aid, first, it will not be in a overt way. It will be actually happening through indirect channels. Both countries have a lot of regional partners. They have regional channels. They have a common border of more than 4,200 kilometers, long. That means that there are ways of doing so. China, of course, will be cautious to not do it in an overt way. Why? Because in reality, it still wants to keep its European trade partners. It is about 800 billion of trade volume with Europeans, and they don't want to waste it. Then, of course, as I said, the what if question. If China does it in an overt way, that would really turn the war into a proxy war, where we finally have to admit that we have two new systemic rivals, the two new superpowers waging, hot war kind of situation along the peripheries, but in fact being engaged in a new Cold War confrontation without, the military involvement against each other. And that would also mean that Russia would lose its global power status, because Russia will be the one proxy, the one of China, whereas Ukraine, as we know, is being supported by the West.
That is actually what many people argued, that for China, they have interest to have this war as long as possible, to have the West being focused on Ukraine. But on another hand, they don't have interest in Russia by winning, because they have interest in having weaker Russia, in having Russia which is bleeding, so China could expand its influence. Is it some sort of the logical analysis of this war, or do we oversee something?
I don't share this assessment. I just don't share this geopolitical assessment that it is in China's strong interest for Russia to become so weak that it starts dissolving, right? I mean, here the idea is Ukraine is winning the war, obviously, at the front, at the military, in military terms, in the battlefields. At the very same time, the West is continuing with this comprehensive support, political, diplomatic, financial, economic one, and obviously the military aid. And at some point of time in the future, it triggers this tipping point for the Russian economy, or let's say for one of the Russian relevant systems, industrial system, military industrial complex whatsoever. And then we see a kind of scenario as in the 90s, a dissolvement of the Russian Federation. Secessionist movements begin, right? Most likely in the northern Caucasus, or in this kind of, territories as we've seen this, in the 90s. But I don't share this assessment. that it is in China's interest to have this huge security vacuum in the north of its border, in this wide, Eurasian terrain, where at the same time China has been engaged in the most severe and the most serious military escalation in the Strait of Taiwan following Nancy Pelosi's visit. It has been engaging in military blockade, so exercising military blockade of the island, testing out different, scenarios, trade blockade, this and that, amassing a lot of military equipment. At the very same time, what many analysts have missed last year is that China was also engaged in a military confrontation with India along the line of actual control. And in fact, Chinese and Indian soldiers, fight it against each other with sticks and with stones, because they have an agreement from 1997 which actually prohibits them to use weapons, because these are two nuclear powers. So, to sum it up, worst military escalation in the Strait of Taiwan. The whole South China Sea region is practically under fire in terms of neighbors of China getting, seriously worried about the overwhelming military presence of Beijing. Then again, the rise of tensions, military tensions, but also what we are going to expect is a kind of geoeconomic competition between India and China. China has demographically peaked, has economically struggled, to go back to these amazing numbers from the last 20 years in terms of economic growth. At the very same time, India being, this huge optimistic story for investors, for companies, and for Western allies, in terms of deviation of global supply chains, in terms of investing. And then, against this background, to openly allow and promote a third front in which China will have to step in, will have to stabilize, will have to intervene, that would be the dissolution of the Russian Federation. It simply makes no sense to me to expect that the Chinese leadership would be really eager to do so. And think about something. What happened in January before the war, before the launch of Russia's war against Ukraine? What happened was the political instability in Kazakhstan. Who stepped in there? It was the Russian special forces, under the condition that Kazakhstan, being a member of the CSTO, the regional organization of Russia, allowed it to happen, and then there was a takeover, a political takeover by Tokayev. But China was okay with that because it was preparing for the Olympics. So now think about the scenario in which China is also taking care of avoiding security vacuum in Afghanistan because of the withdrawal of the US troops. China is having a bigger challenge in the South Asian terrain because of India, and then, in fact, having to take care of the stability and security in the wider Central Asian, Eastern European terrain is absolutely, from a geopolitical point, doesn't make sense in the short run. Now, what we can debate is what happens in the long run, right? That means Ukraine clearly wins the war. The West clearly steps in and provides for Euro-Atlantic integration. And then China has a plan B, and that is to present itself as a mediator, as a constructive global player that has come up with the plan, has tried to communicate with all powers. Right now, it has sent an envoy of peace to Ukraine, to Poland, to Germany, to Russia. By the way, a former top, career diplomat who has spent many years in the in the USSR, in the Soviet Union. So it tells you already what kind of background he has. And in the end, it goes both ways. China has a winning formula in both scenarios. But let's not be fooled. It's still rooting for Plan A.
Yeah, that is like, that sense, for me, it sounds like pretty contradictory signals what China is doing, because when they send an envoy for peace to Ukraine, and today Russia tried to bomb Kyiv with 6 hypersonic, or what they call to be hypersonic missiles, and a lot of drones, it doesn't sound for me like China has its influence on Russia. and can bring Russia like the sort of sense. And on another hand, we know that the Chinese ambassador in France claimed that the countries like Ukraine or Baltic states, they don't have legal rights to exist because, as he believed, or he wanted us to believe, the dissolution of the Soviet Union had no legal ground, which is of course nonsense. Like Ukraine was one of the one of the countries which signed the UN Charter and were like founding nation. So can we read the intentions of China, or should we read them, or should we just say China has nothing to look here, it's our European business and we can solve it by ourselves?
No, we should, and we have to, and that means we have to also learn how to read China's true intentions. And what China is doing is nothing different from what every relevant geopolitical state actor is doing. So relevant geopolitical actors base their strategies and their approach, foreign policy, security policy approach, always first and foremost on national interests. So we need to decipher what the national interests are, what are the real, goals behind these actions, and then from that perspective, from this realpolitik perspective, we can actually derive also conclusions for our policies, how we have to be, prepared accordingly. So that to avoid certain kind of awkward actions or unnecessary steps. Like I argue, for instance, that what the French President Macron did while being on a visit to China is exactly counterproductive to long-term oriented and based on national interests, or in this case European interests, approach of Europe. Why? Because obviously this is exactly what China would be doing in the future. I mean, think about the fact that China has learned one lesson very carefully, and that was the lesson of what has provoked the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, as we know, Xi Jinping has solidified his power with a third mandate for life, has cemented himself in the highest echelons of power within the Communist Party. And we have once again a state actor that is obviously following a certain communist ideology. So some kind of geopolitical deja vu, right, from the Cold War, which is why I also argue that Russia's war against Ukraine, and this is what we missed here in Europe in terms of our assessment, is also a manifestation, actually, of the beginning of the Cold War 2.0 scenario. It was the decision to make a move on the second largest country in Europe, also because Putin would have never launched such a move, such a full-scale war, if he had not relied on the comprehensive, long-term oriented support by China. In that sense, what is the calculus of China? The calculus of China is to first win time to prepare accordingly for this comprehensive decoupling from Washington. Now, America has been the main reason for China's rise over the last 50 years, specifically after the collapse of the Soviet Union, so from the last 30 years. And America will be the main root and the main reason for China's demise, due to the fact that there is actually bipartisan support coming from the Democrats and the Republicans in the future, that there is no way that this entanglement, considering all relevant socioeconomic networks in the global affairs, that these entanglements can continue. But what is also important to understand is that China and the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, even after he came to power in 2013, started also considering the same scenario with a different time frame. With a different time framework, that means that China still needs time. So long as it needs time, it will seek to accommodate with the Europeans. And this means that, of course, the Chinese cannot say from one day to the next that they will break up the relationship with the European powers. On the opposite, they will be applying the Soviet and the Russian playbook. They will be looking for China-friendly governments, for lobbyists, for interest groups, for former politicians, exactly like the Russians did successfully over the last 30 years. And then they will penetrate. What they did was to penetrate the soft belly of Europe, the former so-called Soviet satellites in Central Eastern Europe, and practically now there is a wake-up call. And because of that, they will be going for other, spots like the industrial heart of Europe, like Germany, like France. Why? Because these powers are very much dependent on the Chinese markets and very much dependent on the trade agreement with China.
The soft value allies and how China can penetrate the European economy, and in particular the German economy, we'll come to this question later, but now don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment in the commentary section. Velina, that is amazing what you're talking and what you're explaining, how China tries to play what you call the Soviet and Russia playbook. We have witnessed some months ago the attempts in Germany to sell infrastructure project, terminal in the harbor of Hamburg in the northern Germany to Chinese investors. And this attempt was heavily criticized by German opposition and even by the German government itself, but the German Federal Chancellor Scholz looked to be a supporter of this idea because Germany needs investment. We also know that there were cases of criticism against allowing Chinese companies to invest into digital infrastructure in Germany, in particular into mobile infrastructure. How dangerous can be these investments? We know that years ago, we tried in Germany to follow the same policy with Russia in our belief that we can influence Russia through investments, through bilateral dependencies. Should we repeat this mistake once again with China?
Absolutely no. And by the way, geopolitical experts like myself have always been pointing to the risks linked to the over-dependence on a sole supplier, on a sole state actor, on a sole company. This is something that no sane state actor shall ever do. Here we have several similar problems. First, being the problem of over-dependence on China for the raw materials, for the rare earths, for the minerals that are critical not only for our energy transition, but for the digitalization, for the whole, package of the fourth industrial revolution. The European dependence on China is to 98%. So diversifying away from China as a supplier is the first absolute, must policy that needs to happen. Second, as you pointed out, we have this critical dependence on Chinese technology. Now, we know for a fact that China strives to become a technological power number one. In fact, they want to win the fourth industrial revolution. Why? Because they know that the power that will be riding the wave of the fourth industrial revolution, that will be the winner with the most technological breakthroughs, will be the power that will impose the next rules of the game, that will shape the next global order. This happened with Great Britain during the first and the second industrial revolution, and this happened with the United States during the 70s when they were competing with the Soviet Union over the supremacy in the third industrial revolution. So here, once again, we have two frontrunners and everyone else is lagging behind. Everyone else is trying to somehow, navigate and, capitalize by siding with the one or the other. Like I said, Russia has sided with China long ago and actually has sided with China also for its own, national interests. But the telecommunication field is only one of many in which China will be striving for supremacy. Here we have to ask ourselves, why did we not actually push for our own companies? Why did we not listen to the Americans when they were actually ready to invest in our own European, let's say, frontrunners, technological telecommunication frontrunners? Instead, we decided, and this was the policy before the pandemic hit, this was the statement by intelligence services in many of the European countries, not only in Germany, with few exceptions, which were saying that there were no security risks. But in fact, there are geopolitical risks because China would have a leverage which it could use to exercise political influence. Because think about the scenario in which China decides to withdraw. So this means a direct political pressure on governments, which do not have a plan B.
Exactly, and that will be our own companies which would influence our own government by saying, oh, don't be so rude with China because otherwise we will lose our market. That reminds me of how we proceed to the idea of Wandel durch Handel, change through trade. And the change indeed happened in the German-Russian relations, but on the wrong side, not in Russia, but in Germany. But is it legally possible to limit this influence of Chinese investments in Germany? The security clause is very clear, we can use it, but you cannot use it every time.
It is legally possible, and in fact, the European Commission and also the member states have been coming up with different ideas in their strategy papers and in their, doctrines, but also through different initiatives, how to screen investments in the future. The share of foreign investments should be limited when it comes to critical infrastructure, like it is the case with, with ports. But at the very same time, we see that when there is a political will, there is always a way. So, by the way, the example with Hamburg is not an individual example. If you take a look at the most critical ports in Europe, so if you take a look at the map, most of these ports in Greece, Spain, Netherlands, now Germany, Italy was considering to become a huge part of the BRI initiative. They all have actually share of Chinese, investments, and China is already part of this. So this is a formula which is not based on the logic of cost-benefit analysis like we are used to it. In the West, you do a business, decision. You take a business decision based on this cost-benefit analysis, and then only if it's worth it, right? Then you invest only if you see actually a return of your investments. This is not the Chinese calculus. The Chinese calculus is to invest in everything that could turn into a geopolitical or geoeconomic asset in the future.
Now that is exactly what Russians did with weaponizing everything, and the Chinese politicizing everything, like turning the investments into political leverage. And it's not only Germany. We can look, as you said, on the smaller countries with not that massive economies, which depend massively on Chinese investments in infrastructure, like from the highways to the ports. And now we look also at Ukraine, and we know that Chinese try to invest massively in Ukraine, also in the military production in Ukraine, like Motor Sich engine plant. Will Chinese abandon this strategy of buying the low-hanging fruits on Balkans, Ukraine, and other countries?
No, why should they? Why should they? I mean, it has been a very, very successful winning formula for Chinese economic interests in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe, and also in Asia. And this is the way forward for them in terms of global power projection. They know that being trade partner number one of most of the world, meanwhile, I mean, in the last 20 years, what eventually happened is that they surpassed America as trade partner number one of most of the countries.
Is it because the West is too reluctant to come and to invest?
I think it's because there are objective reasons here as well. I mean, very inconvenient ones, but we need to name them as well. And that is, that Europe, specifically Europe, America could handle this kind of decline in terms of, decline from a unipolar moment of supreme, global power projection. Yes, America is still the only state actor with the capabilities to globally deploy, military forces. But at the very same time, they could handle this decline in terms of unipolar, global order by extending their, forging new partnerships, new alliances, extending, their economic networks. But what happened to Europe is that, despite the most successful economic project, which is the European integration, including new markets, without the necessity of waging wars, because Russia is waging a war to actually incorporate the second largest, state with its demography, with its territories, with its minerals, raw materials, not just, for the sake of territory, but also for the sake of population and for the sake of commodities. So in reality, we did this successful project. We managed actually to, to enlarge without waging wars. But at the very same time, right now we are in a situation here in Europe where we have a significant, demographic problem. We have been shrinking in terms of, share of global GDP, share of, demography in the world, and that translates also into, into new challenges. We have a huge amount of welfare system that needs to be further supported. We used all the dividends from the last 30 years in which we did not invest in global supply chains, we did not invest in our industries, we did not invest, in our defense sector, and we used the dividends from the protection of the Americans to invest in social welfare. Which means now that this bubble that has grown needs to be fed, and there is, increasingly turning problematic for the European governments to do so. So what I'm trying to say is that we could not actually engage with the rest of the world in this successful way like the Chinese did. You named some examples, like they offered a lot of loans, they offered a lot of infrastructure, they built a lot of things. So we should not put the whole blame on those competitors who came up with a better, formula how to engage with the world. We should ask ourselves what happened that we actually did not manage to promote our companies, our business model, and because our business model is always also linked to our political, system of the way how we look at the world, being based not only on rules but also on values. I think that this is going to increasingly be challenging because there are more competitors, there are more, stories that are being sold, and that creates more opportunities for Africans, for Latin Americans, for Asians. And here we should do better in the future.
That looks pretty challenging, what you describe, and we know that China is indeed making a successful story in many countries where we are losing our influence and our representation. But my last question would be very simple. If we're talking about the Cold War 2.0, can we win this war like we did with the first one?
Yes, we can. We can win this war. First, we have to, of course, make sure that Ukraine wins against Russia, because this is also our war. No matter what politician says, Russia is waging and has been waging a non-kinetic war against all of us, against the Europeans, against the European societies, against the European governments, against the European businesses and industries. And we have to win this non-kinetic war together with the Ukrainians winning the kinetic war that is being waged against them. That is the golden rule, that is the necessary condition. We need to prevent a two-front scenario from happening, because knowing that the Americans will be increasingly dealing with China in the future and will be increasingly putting the focus on the Indo-Pacific, that means that we will be increasingly dealing with the second front if Russia wins the war. That is the first condition. The second condition is obviously the one to admit and prepare our societies accordingly, that we are in a Cold War 2.0 scenario, that it is about the West versus the dragon bear, that it's not just China, that if Russia wins the war against Ukraine, it will not only destroy the European security order, it will not only create a vacuum, security vacuum on the old continent, it will not only operate with a new concept of powers, where some European powers will seek to accommodate. They will not fight the Russians. They will actually accommodate economically, like it happened in the past. And in that case, once again, we want to avoid this, right? So we have to admit that it is a Cold War in a sense that neither United States nor China and Russia want to get engaged in a direct military confrontation, in a direct war against each other. But what they're going to do is cold confrontation in all these various fields of weaponization of dependencies, of creating blocks based on commodities, of creating blocks based on international rules and norms, of creating partnerships based on trade or economic issues, or infrastructure projects or connectivity. So it's going to be a competition over the hearts and minds. So it's going to have an ideological competition as well. And if we do not prepare our, societies and our, businesses and political stakeholders, how are they going to cope with this, cognitive warfare or non-kinetic warfare? They will be exposed because we are all democracies. We are like an open box of chocolates. Everyone is invited to take, a chocolate or, to put their hand into the box. But at the very same time, we're dealing with closed systems, just like it was the case during the Cold War, where we have no idea what our adversary is capable of, what exactly the strategy is. And we are fighting like in the dark without the special, glasses that soldiers have to have visibility. This is what we are doing. So instead of tapping into the dark, let's open the eyes to the reality and let's get confronted with the reality and let's prepare for the worst case scenario, which is, like I said, the one where the dragon bear will be fighting on all these terrains. And fighting nowadays is not just doesn't mean the use of military means. It is about everything. It is including all layers of warfare, space, air forces, land forces, maritime, information warfare, hybrid warfare. So all of this means actually avoiding the worst case scenario by being prepared. So hoping for the best while preparing for the worst. And that means finally being straightforward about the real intentions of our competitors, but also being straightforward about our real potential and our capabilities.
That is very inspiring and informative. Like, don't be a box of chocolate, but be a soldier with night vision device fighting the enemies in the darkness with the good chances to win this fight. This was a video podcast of European Resilience Initiative Center. Today, our guest was Velina Tchakarova, geopolitical strategist consultant, founder of Face Strategic Consultancy Agency. Stay with us, share, like, subscribe, and don't forget to watch our next videos. See you later.